Her new boss is the secret father of her son. When the CEO found out, a struggling single mother, takes a job she desperately needs, never expecting her new boss to be the man from her past. He's cold, powerful, untouchable, and he has no idea the little boy waiting after work carries his blood. Then one quiet moment changes everything, when a child speaks the truth no one was ready to hear. A hidden condition, a buried mistake, a secret that could destroy careers, families, and a child's future. As power, money, and fear close in, one man must choose between protecting his empire or protecting his son. When the truth finally comes out, will love be strong enough to hold them together, or will it tear them all apart? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now. And if this story speaks to you, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The gentle rays of dawn filtered through threadbare curtains, casting soft shadows across Rose Hart's small but tidy apartment. She moved quietly through her morning routine, her bare feet padding softly on the worn linoleum floor as she prepared breakfast. Her hands worked automatically to measure out the instant oatmeal, the affordable kind, not the fancy-flavored packets her son Noah loved, while her mind wandered to the stack of medical bills tucked away in her bedside drawer. "Lord, give me strength for this day," she whispered, a prayer as natural as breathing. The digital clock on the microwave blinked 5:45, its red numbers a reminder that every minute counted. Down the narrow hallway she could hear Noah stirring. Rose smiled, despite her worries. That boy had an internal clock that never failed. "Good morning, sunshine," she called out, keeping her voice steady and warm, masking the anxiety that had kept her up most of the night. "Mummy!" Noah's voice carried that special kind of morning cheerfulness that only 5-year-olds seemed to possess. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, his Batman pajamas slightly twisted, dark curls standing up in all directions. His brown eyes, so like her own, sparkled with excitement. Rose knelt down, opening her arms for their morning hug. Noah's small body felt fragile against hers, and she had to push away the familiar fear that came with his condition. The doctors had explained it all. The rare genetic disorder, the ongoing treatments, the uncertain prognosis. But in moments like these, with Noah's heart beating strong against her chest, Rose chose to focus on the present. "Ready for breakfast, baby?" she asked, running her fingers through his unruly hair. "We've got oatmeal today." Noah's nose wrinkled slightly, but he nodded bravely. "Can I have extra brown sugar?" "Just a little," Rose compromised, thinking of the quarter-full container in her cupboard. She'd have to make it last until her first paycheck from the new job. As they sat at their small kitchen table, Rose watched Noah carefully, spooning his breakfast. His movements were deliberate, focused, so different from other children his age. He'd learned early on to be careful with his body, to avoid the bruising that came so easily with his condition. "Are you excited about kindergarten today?" Rose asked, sipping her coffee slowly to make it last. Noah nodded, a bit of oatmeal clinging to his chin. "Miss Sarah said we're going to learn about butterflies this week." He paused, thoughtful. "Mummy, do butterflies get scared when they're changing?" The question caught Rose off guard, as Noah's insights often did. "I suppose they might," she answered carefully. "But God gives them exactly what they need to become beautiful and strong. Like how God gives us what we need." Noah's eyes were serious now. Rose swallowed hard, thinking of the new job she was starting today, executive assistant at Crow Enterprises. The salary would finally cover Noah's treatments, provide stability they'd never known. "That's right, baby, exactly like that." After breakfast, Rose helped Noah dress in his carefully ironed school clothes, khaki pants, and a blue polo shirt that made his eyes shine. As she combed his hair, her mind drifted back 5 years to a night she'd never told anyone about. A charity gala where she'd been working as a server, a handsome man in an expensive suit, kind words that led to dinner. And then… Rose shook her head, pushing the memory away. That night had given her Noah, and she couldn't regret it, even with all the struggles that followed. But she'd made peace with raising him alone, had never tried to contact the man she'd known only as Charles. Her pride and her faith had carried her through the hardest times. All set, sweetheart? Rose checked Noah's backpack one last time. Medication, emergency contact numbers, his favorite stuffed elephant for quiet time. Everything in its place, just as she liked it. The drive to Noah's school was quiet, filled with their usual morning prayers and Noah's soft humming. After dropping him off with a tight hug and a reminder to be careful at recess, Rose straightened her second-hand blazer and headed downtown. The Crow Enterprises building rose before her like a glass mountain, its windows reflecting the morning sun. Rose parked her aging Honda in the employee lot, checking her lipstick one last time in the rearview mirror. Lord, I'm grateful for this opportunity, she prayed. Help me make the most of it. The lobby was all marble and chrome, making her sensible heels click loudly as she walked towards the security desk. Everything screamed power and money, so different from the community college where she'd been working part-time. Rose clutched her purse tighter, feeling out of place despite her carefully chosen outfit. The security guard checked her ID and handed her a temporary badge. 35th floor, he directed, pointing to the bank of elevators. Welcome to Crow Enterprises. Rose was admiring the elegant lobby, her head tilted back to take in the soaring ceiling, when movement caught her eye. The elevator doors were opening, and a man was stepping out, tall, distinguished, in an impeccably tailored suit. Her heart stopped. Charles Crow, the CEO himself. The man from that night 5 years ago, the man who had given her Noah. He hadn't seen her yet, was focused on his phone as he walked. But Rose couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Because there, in the sharp angle of his jaw, the set of his shoulders, she saw echoes of her son. The son he didn't know existed. Rose's hand found the cross she always wore around her neck, her fingers closing around it like an anchor. This was her test, she realized. This was her butterfly moment, and she had no idea how she would survive the change that was coming. The distance between them was shrinking. 10 steps. 5. 3. Charles Crow looked up from his phone. The elevator ride to the 35th floor felt endless. Rose's heart hammered against her ribs as she stood beside Charles Crow, grateful that 3 other employees had crowded in after them. His cologne, still the same after all these years, filled the enclosed space, bringing back memories she'd tried so hard to suppress. Charles was absorbed in his phone, his fingers moving rapidly across the screen. He hadn't given her a second glance in the lobby, his eyes sliding past her as if she were just another face in the crowd. Rose wasn't sure if that made things better or worse. The elevator dinged, and everyone filed out onto the executive floor. Rose followed Charles's tall figure down the hallway, her new heels clicking against the polished floor. The office suite was impressive, all glass and steel, with sweeping views of the city skyline. Mr. Crow. A sharp-voiced woman intercepted them, tablet in hand. Your 8:15 is waiting in the conference room, and Tokyo needs an answer about the merger by noon. Thank you, Margaret. Charles's voice was exactly as Rose remembered, deep and measured, with just a hint of warmth. This is Ms. Hart, my new executive assistant. Please show her the ropes this morning. Margaret, a slim woman in her 50s with steel-grey hair, gave Rose an appraising look. Of course. Follow me, Ms. Hart. The next hour was a whirlwind of information. Margaret walked Rose through the computer systems, security protocols, and Charles's particular preferences. He takes his coffee black, 2 cups before 10 a.m. Never interrupt him when his office door is closed unless it's his son's school calling. All calls are screened, no exceptions. Rose absorbed everything, grateful for the distraction from her churning emotions. She'd known she'd be working closely with Charles, but the reality of it was overwhelming. Every time his voice carried through the open door of his office, she felt that familiar flutter in her stomach. These are the files for the Thompson project. Margaret continued, pointing to a stack of folders. Mr. Crow needs the executive summary by 2 p.m. Think you can handle that? Rose straightened her shoulders. Absolutely. As the morning progressed, Rose settled into a rhythm. She reviewed contracts, scheduled meetings, and fielded calls with the efficiency that had earned her excellent references. Around 11:30, Charles emerged from his office. "Miss Hart," he said, and Rose forced herself to meet his eyes calmly. "How are you finding everything?" "Very well, thank you, Mr. Crow." Her voice remained steady, professional. "I've completed the Thompson summary and reorganized next week's calendar to accommodate the board meeting changes." Something flickered in his expression. Approval, perhaps. "Excellent. Margaret chose well." Throughout lunch, Rose met various staff members who stopped by her desk to introduce themselves. Sarah from accounting brought her a cookie from the break room. James from legal helped her navigate the company's complex filing system. Everyone seemed curious about the new assistant who'd landed the coveted position. By mid-afternoon, Rose had fallen into a comfortable routine. She'd almost managed to forget who Charles was, almost when he called her into his office. "Have a seat, Ms. Hart." He gestured to the chair across from his desk. The late afternoon sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, highlighting the silver at his temples. "I wanted to review the week's schedule with you." Rose sat carefully, her notepad ready. As Charles went through his commitments, she couldn't help noticing the family photo on his desk. A boy around 10 or 11, with Charles's strong jaw and serious expression. A half-brother Noah would never know. "One last thing," Charles said, checking his watch. "I have a dinner meeting tonight at 7. Could you stay late to prepare the briefing materials?" Rose's heart skipped. Noah's after-school program ended at 5:30. "Of course," she said, already reaching for her phone to text Mrs. Rodriguez next door, who often watched Noah in emergencies. "I'll have everything ready for you." The hours ticked by. Rose worked efficiently, pushing aside her worry about Noah. Mrs. Rodriguez had confirmed she could pick him up, but Noah wasn't comfortable with changes to his routine. Still, this job was too important to risk. They needed the health insurance, the stability. At 5:45, Rose's phone buzzed. A text from Mrs. Rodriguez. "Noah insisted on coming to your office. We're in the lobby." Panic fluttered in Rose's chest. She glanced at Charles's closed office door, then at the stack of documents she was still organizing. Making a quick decision, she called down to security and authorized them to send Noah and Mrs. Rodriguez up. Minutes later, the elevator doors opened. Noah stepped out, his backpack clutched to his chest, looking small and uncertain in the vast marble hallway. Mrs. Rodriguez squeezed his shoulder and promised to pick him up tomorrow if needed. "Come here, baby," Rose whispered, gathering Noah into her arms. "I'm sorry, but Mommy needs to work a little longer. Can you sit quietly and draw for a while?" Noah nodded solemnly. Rose settled him in the small seating area near her desk, providing him with his coloring books and his stuffed elephant. He began drawing with his usual careful concentration, his dark head bent over the page. Rose returned to her work, stealing glances at Noah every few minutes. The office was quiet except for the gentle scratch of Noah's crayons and the distant hum of the cleaning crew. She was so focused on finishing the briefing materials that she didn't hear Charles's door open. "Ms. Hart, before I leave—" Charles stopped abruptly, his eyes landing on Noah. Rose's heart seemed to stop beating altogether. Charles stood very still, something strange passing across his face as he looked at Noah. His expression shifted from surprise to curiosity to something deeper, something almost like recognition, though Rose knew that was impossible. "I apologize," Rose said quickly, standing. "My son's after-school care fell through. He'll be very quiet." "No need to apologize." Charles's voice was distant, his eyes still fixed on Noah, who had looked up from his drawing with those serious eyes that were so like his father's. "He seems very well behaved." The moment stretched, heavy with unspoken things. Then Charles shook himself slightly, as if coming out of a trance. "The briefing materials?" "Right here, Mr. Crow." Rose handed him the folder with slightly trembling hands. "Thank you, Miss Hart." He nodded to her, then glanced once more at Noah before heading towards the elevator. Just before the doors closed, Rose saw him looking back at her son, that puzzled expression still on his face. Rose sank into her chair, her legs weak. In all her prayers and preparations for this job, she'd never imagined this scenario, her two worlds colliding so suddenly, so completely. Noah went back to his drawing, unaware of the magnitude of what had just happened, while Rose sat at her desk, wondering how long she could keep the truth hidden when it was written so clearly in her son's face. The autumn morning air held a crisp bite as Rose walked hand in hand with Noah toward Lincoln Elementary School. Fallen leaves crunched beneath their feet, and Noah's Batman backpack bounced gently against his small frame with each careful step. "Remember what we talked about?" Rose asked, squeezing his hand gently. "If you start feeling tired, go to the nurse right away." Noah finished, looking up at her with those serious dark eyes. "I know, Mommy." Rose's heart squeezed. At 5 years old, Noah already carried such awareness of his limitations. She stopped at the school entrance and knelt down to straighten his collar, using the moment to study his face for any signs of fatigue. His brown skin held its usual warm glow, but she could see the slight shadows under his eyes from another restless night. "I love you to the moon and back," she whispered, pulling him close. "And to the stars and more." Noah completed their daily ritual, wrapping his arms around her neck. Rose watched him walk into his classroom, his steps measured and careful, so different from the energetic running of his classmates. When he turned to wave one last time, she forced herself to smile brightly, holding it until he disappeared inside. Only then did she let her shoulders slump, offering up her daily prayer for his protection. The drive to Crow Enterprises gave her time to shift mental gears, to push aside her motherly worries and focus on being the capable executive assistant she needed to be. But today, her usual compartmentalization felt harder. Charles's strange reaction to Noah yesterday had left her unsettled, and she couldn't shake the feeling that her carefully constructed walls were beginning to crack. The morning passed in a blur of meetings and phone calls. Rose maintained her professional facade, even as she felt Charles's gaze lingering on her more than usual. Around 3 o'clock, her phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Rodriguez saying she couldn't watch Noah today. Rose glanced at her calendar. No late meetings scheduled. She could leave on time and pick up Noah herself. At 4:45, Noah appeared in the office reception area, escorted by a security guard who had clearly taken a shine to him. Rose watched through the glass walls as Noah thanked the guard solemnly, his manners impeccable as always. "Hi, baby," she called softly. "Just give me 15 minutes to finish up, okay?" Noah nodded and settled into what had become his spot in the waiting area, pulling out his homework with careful movements. Rose noticed Charles watching through his office window, that same unsettled expression on his face from yesterday. Rose turned back to her computer, but her attention was pulled away moments later by her phone ringing. She recognized the number, Dr. Patterson's office. "Mrs. Hart, we're calling about Noah's latest test results and to schedule his next appointment." Rose glanced around. The office was nearly empty, and Charles appeared absorbed in his work. She kept her voice low. "How are his numbers looking?" "The genetic markers for his condition are showing some concerning patterns. Dr. Patterson wants to adjust his medication and see him next week instead of waiting for his monthly checkup." Rose's stomach clenched. "The same condition his She caught herself. "The same hereditary condition?" "Yes, the same rare genetic disorder. We need to monitor it more closely. The doctor can explain more at the appointment, but with hereditary autonomic dysfunction being so uncommon, we want to stay ahead of any changes." "Of course," Rose said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Whatever he needs." She scheduled the appointment, her hand shaking as she wrote it down. What she didn't notice was Charles standing in his doorway, frozen, his face pale. He'd come to ask her a question but stopped at the mention of the condition. His condition. The same rare genetic disorder he'd struggled with his entire life. Later, after Rose had gathered Noah and left for the day, Charles sat alone in his dimly lit office. His laptop screen glowed with medical websites and research papers about hereditary autonomic dysfunction. The condition affected less than 0.01% of the population. The chances of two unrelated people having it were astronomical. His fingers moved across the keyboard, pulling up more information. The disorder was hereditary, passed down through direct bloodlines. His own father had had it, and Charles had inherited it. Now, seeing the dates, doing the math, remembering that one night 5 years ago when his carefully controlled life had briefly spun off its axis. Charles leaned back in his chair, his world tilting on its foundation. The boy's careful movements, so like his own childhood habits. Those serious, dark eyes that had seemed so familiar. The medical condition that had shaped his entire life. The pieces were falling into place, forming a picture that both terrified and transfixed him. Outside his window, the city lights began to twinkle on, one by one, as Charles sat motionless, staring at the medical data that seemed to confirm what his heart had already begun to suspect. The evening shadows lengthened across the Crow Enterprises offices as most employees headed home. Rose's desk lamp cast a warm glow over her workspace while she tackled one final urgent task. Charles had requested a complete analysis of their West Coast expansion numbers before tomorrow morning's board meeting, and she was determined to deliver excellence. "Just a few more minutes, baby," she said softly to Noah, who sat quietly at the small conference table near her desk, coloring in his favorite dinosaur book. Noah looked up and nodded, his serious eyes understanding beyond his years. "It's okay, Mommy. I like it here." Rose's heart squeezed at his patience. At 5 years old, he shouldered burdens no child should have to bear. Long hours at the office, medical appointments, and the weight of being different from other kids his age. Yet he never complained. The printer hummed to life as Rose sent the completed report to print. She gathered her things, ready to clip the documents together and leave them on Charles's desk before heading home. When she looked up again, Noah's spot at the conference table was empty. Her heart skipped a beat. "Noah?" she called out, trying to keep her voice calm. The office floor was mostly deserted, but she still worried about him wandering around alone. That's when she noticed Charles's office door was slightly ajar, warm light spilling out. She heard the soft murmur of voices inside, one deep and familiar, the other small and clear. Rose moved towards the door, her steps quickening. Through the glass walls, she could see Noah standing in front of Charles's massive desk, looking up at her boss who had risen from his chair. Something in their postures made her pause, a mirror image of careful stillness, of contained energy. "You look like me," Noah was saying, his head tilted to one side. "And you move careful, like I do." Charles stood frozen, staring down at the boy with an expression Rose had never seen before, something raw and vulnerable breaking through his usual mask of control. Charles started to speak, but words seemed to fail him. Noah took a small step closer, his eyes never leaving Charles's face. The moment stretched, delicate as spun glass, as Noah studied the man before him with that peculiar intensity he sometimes showed. Then, in the clear, innocent voice of a child speaking in simple truth, Noah whispered, "Mommy says you're my daddy." Time seemed to stop. The air itself grew thick and heavy. Rose felt as though she were moving through water as she pushed the door open, her heart thundering in her chest. "Noah!" she gasped, horror flooding through her veins. Charles's head snapped up, his face draining of color as his eyes met hers. The careful walls he maintained, the precise control he wielded over every aspect of his life, all of it crumbled in that single moment of recognition. Rose rushed forward, her hands trembling as she reached for Noah. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Crow. He shouldn't have. I never—" The words tangled in her throat. Charles took an unsteady step backward, his hand gripping the edge of his desk so tightly his knuckles went white. His breathing had grown shallow, a telltale sign of stress that Rose recognized from her research into his condition, their son's condition. "Go home," he said, his voice rough and unfamiliar. "Both of you. Go home now." "Mr. Crow, please, I can explain." Rose tried again, drawing Noah close to her side. "Now." The word came out sharp and final, cutting through the tension like a blade. Noah pressed against her leg, suddenly uncertain in the face of Charles's rigid posture and tight expression. Rose could feel her son trembling slightly, and maternal instinct overcame everything else. She needed to get him out of there, away from the emotional storm brewing in Charles's eyes. "Yes, sir," she managed, guiding Noah towards the door. "I'll have the report on your desk first thing tomorrow." Charles didn't respond. He remained statue still, staring at the spot where Noah had stood, as if he could still see the ghost of his own childhood reflected in the boy's careful movements. Rose gathered their belongings quickly, her movements mechanical while her mind raced. 5 years of careful secrets, of protected truths, all undone by a child's innocent whisper. She could feel the foundations of the life she'd built shifting beneath her feet. As they waited for the elevator, Noah looked up at her with worried eyes. "Did I say something wrong, Mommy?" Rust swallowed hard, smoothing her hand over his dark curls. So like his father's. "No, baby," she whispered. "You just spoke the truth. Sometimes the truth is hard for grown-ups to hear." The elevator doors closed on the image of Charles still standing in his office, outlined against the city lights, his world shaken beyond repair, just as surely as hers had been 5 years ago. In the quiet car ride home, Rose's hands gripped the steering wheel as she fought back tears. She glanced in the rearview mirror at Noah, who had fallen asleep in his car seat, his face peaceful in the passing streetlights. All her careful plans, all her protective walls, had crumbled in a single evening. Tomorrow would bring consequences she couldn't predict. But for now, she could only pray for strength to face whatever came next. The night settled around them as they drove home, the city lights blurring through her unshed tears. Behind them, in his office high above the streets, Charles Crow stood at his window, staring out at nothing, while 5 years of unspoken truth reformed his entire world into something he no longer recognized. Rose's hands shook as she turned the key in the lock of her apartment door. Noah had fallen asleep in the car, and she carried his warm, heavy weight against her shoulder. The familiar scent of his shampoo mingled with the lingering trace of Charles's cologne that still clung to Noah's sweater from their brief encounter. The combination made her stomach clench. She laid Noah gently on his bed, carefully removing his shoes and tucking him in without waking him. In sleep, his face held that perfect innocence that always made her heart ache. Tonight, it brought fresh tears to her eyes. "I'm so sorry, baby," she whispered, smoothing his dark curls away from his forehead. "I thought I was protecting you." Moving to the living room, Rose sank onto her worn couch and buried her face in her hands. The shame and fear she'd been holding back crashed over her in waves. 5 years of careful silence, of protecting her son while building a life for them both, had unraveled in a single moment of childish honesty. Across town, in his penthouse apartment 42 stories above the city, Charles Crowe stood at his floor-to-ceiling windows. The city sprawled before him, a glittering tapestry of lights that usually brought him comfort. Tonight, they blurred together as his mind replayed the moment over and over. "Mommy says you're my daddy." The words echoed in his head, accompanied by the image of Noah's earnest face, a face that now seemed hauntingly familiar. Charles walked to his home office, his movements mechanical. He pulled up his calendar from 5 years ago, scrolling through entries until he found what he was looking for: the charity gala, the night he'd broken his own rules about mixing business with pleasure. The woman in the blue dress who'd listened to him talk about his childhood, his condition, his fears, things he'd never told anyone else. She'd disappeared by morning, leaving only a handwritten note thanking him for a lovely evening. Rose Hart. The name that had meant nothing to him 2 weeks ago now burned in his mind. Charles poured himself 2 fingers of scotch, but left it untouched on his desk. His hands moved across his keyboard, pulling up medical records he technically shouldn't have access to. Noah's file contained details of his condition, the same rare genetic disorder Charles had struggled with his entire life. The coincidence had bothered him even before Noah's revelation. But now... His finger hovered over the phone. One call to his private medical team would confirm what he already suspected. The scotch remained untouched as dawn broke over the city. The next day passed in a blur for both Rose and Charles. She arrived at work early, braced for confrontation, but Charles had left instructions that he would be working from home. The office hummed with speculation about his unusual absence, but Rose kept her head down and focused on her tasks with rigid determination. Noah stayed with her sister that night, giving Rose space to pace her apartment, jumping at every sound that might be a knock at her door. But no one came. The second day brought more of the same uncertain tension. Charles remained absent from the office, though projects and decisions flowed from his home office as efficiently as ever. Rose felt like she was holding her breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Late in the afternoon of the second day, Charles sat in his home office, staring at the envelope that had just been delivered. Inside lay the results of the DNA test he'd ordered, using samples from Noah's medical records and his own doctor's files. His hands were steady as he opened it, but his heart thundered in his chest. The clinical language swam before his eyes until he found the percentage he was looking for: 99.9% probability of paternity. Charles Crowe, the man who controlled vast business empires, who had built his life on careful planning and absolute control, fell to his knees. The paper crumpled in his grip as emotions he couldn't name crashed through him. Somewhere in the city, in a modest apartment he'd never visited, was his son. A boy who moved carefully, just like him. A boy who carried his genetic legacy, his condition, his blood. The carefully constructed walls of his life lay in ruins around him as the truth sank in. He was a father. He had been for 5 years without knowing it. The weight of lost time, of moments he could never recover, pressed down on his shoulders until he could barely breathe. The sun set over the city, casting long shadows across the floor where Charles remained kneeling, the DNA results clutched in his hand, his world forever altered by the scientific confirmation of what a 5-year-old's innocent words had already told him. The morning sun cast long shadows through the windows of Crow Enterprises as Rose stepped out of the elevator. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched her tablet, trying to maintain her composure. The message had arrived 15 minutes ago, a simple request from Charles Crow to meet in his office at 8 o'clock sharp. The executive floor was eerily quiet. Most employees wouldn't arrive for another hour, leaving Rose alone with the soft hum of the air conditioning and the click of her heels against marble floors. She paused outside Charles's office, took a deep breath, and knocked. "Come in, Ms. Hart." His voice was steady, controlled, the voice of a man who had made 1,000 difficult decisions. Rose entered, her back straight, chin lifted with quiet dignity despite the fear churning in her stomach. Charles stood by the window, his tall frame silhouetted against the morning light. He didn't turn immediately, and Rose noticed the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands were clasped tightly behind his back. When he finally faced her, his expression was not what she expected. There was no anger, no accusation, only a profound sadness that made him look older than his 42 years. "Please sit down," he said, gesturing to one of the leather chairs in front of his desk. Rose settled into it, her hands folded in her lap to hide their trembling. Charles didn't sit behind his desk as usual. Instead, he chose the chair beside her, turning it slightly to face her. "I have something to show you," he said quietly, reaching for an envelope on his desk. He removed a single sheet of paper and held it for a moment, as if its weight was far greater than mere paper should be. "Though I suspect you already know what this will confirm." Rose's throat tightened as she accepted the document. The medical letterhead was crisp and official, the language clinical and precise. But the numbers, 99.9%, struck her like a physical blow. She had known, of course. She had always known. But seeing it there in black and white made it impossibly real. "I'm not angry, Rose." Charles's voice was gentle, surprising them both. "I'm grieving. 5 years. 5 years I didn't know I had a son. 5 years of his life I can never get back." Rose's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I tried to find you afterward, but you'd left the country for business. Then weeks passed, and months, and She shook her head. "I convinced myself it was better this way, that Noah and I would be fine on our own." Charles leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Tell me about him, please. I need to know everything." For the next hour, Rose shared stories about Noah. His first words, his first steps, his love of dinosaurs and space. She spoke of his quiet bravery during medical treatments, his gentle heart, his uncanny ability to make friends with anyone. With each story, she watched Charles's face change, saw the emotion he tried to hide as he learned about the son he never knew he had. "He has your eyes," Rose said softly, "and your way of thinking things through so carefully. Sometimes he'll get this look on his face when he's concentrating, and it's exactly like yours." Charles stood abruptly, moving back to the window. When he spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. "I want to make this right, Rose. I need to make this right. Not just for Noah, but for you as well. You've carried this burden alone for too long." He turned back to face her, his expression resolute. "I have a proposal. My penthouse has 6 bedrooms, more than enough space. I want you and Noah to move in." Rose started to protest, but Charles held up a hand. "Please, hear me out. This isn't just about convenience. It's about protection, yours and Noah's. Once this becomes public knowledge, and it will, the media attention will be relentless. My home has security, privacy, and the space to give everyone room to adjust to these changes. He moved to his desk, pulling out a folder. I've had my lawyers draw up an agreement. It protects your rights and Noah's. You'll have your own wing of the penthouse, complete autonomy in your daily lives, and a substantial monthly allowance for Noah's care and education. All I'm asking for is the chance to know my son, to be part of his life, and to provide the security you both deserve. Rose's mind whirled with the implications. The practical part of her saw the wisdom in his offer, the security, the medical care Noah could receive, the opportunities it would provide. But her heart ached at the thought of leaving their small apartment, the home where every scratch on the wall held a memory. I need time to think about this, she said quietly. Charles nodded. Of course. Take the rest of the day. Go home, look over the agreement, but Rose... His voice softened. I want you to know that this isn't about control or power. It's about responsibility, and yes, about love. A love I didn't know I could feel until I heard those words from Noah's lips. Rose gathered her things and left the office in a daze, the legal documents heavy in her bag. The day passed in a blur as she moved through her apartment, touching familiar walls, looking at photos of Noah's childhood. By evening, she had read the agreement 3 times, each review confirming the fairness and generosity of Charles's offer. As darkness fell, Rose knelt beside her bed as she did every night. Her prayer was different this time, filled with questions and fears she'd never voiced before. Lord, she whispered, give me wisdom. Show me the right path, not just for me, but for Noah. Help me set aside my pride, my fear, my need for control. Help me see your hand in all of this. The silence that followed was heavy with possibility. Rose opened her eyes, looking at the photo of Noah on her nightstand, her beautiful, brave boy who deserved every opportunity life could offer. She thought of Charles's face when he spoke of wanting to know his son. The genuine pain in his eyes over the lost years. With trembling fingers, she reached for her phone and typed a simple message. We accept. Her thumb hovered over the send button as tears slipped down her cheeks. This wasn't the life she had planned, but perhaps it was the life Noah needed. With a quiet prayer for strength, she pressed send, knowing that with this simple action, their lives would never be the same. The morning sun cast long shadows across Rose's small apartment as she folded Noah's favorite dinosaur t-shirt and placed it carefully in a cardboard box. Her hands trembled slightly as she moved through the familiar motions of packing their life into containers labeled with neat black marker. Mummy, can I bring all my books? Noah called from his bedroom, his voice muffled by the stack of picture books he was trying to carry. Rose managed a smile, walking over to help him. Of course, sweetheart. Mr. Crow has plenty of room for your books. You mean Daddy? Noah asked innocently, dropping the books into an open box. The word hung in the air, making Rose's heart skip a beat. Yes, she said softly. Your Daddy. The doorbell chimed at exactly 9 o'clock. Charles stood in the hallway, looking somewhat out of place in his casual weekend clothes, dark jeans and a grey sweater that probably cost more than Rose's monthly rent. Good morning, he said formally. The movers are downstairs. I thought I might help with any last-minute packing. Noah peeked around Rose's legs, his eyes wide with curiosity. Charles shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsure how to interact with his newly discovered son. Hi, Noah said shyly. Want to see my rock collection? Before Charles could respond, Noah darted back to his room. Rose watched as Charles's shoulders relaxed slightly. He's been organizing those rocks for weeks, she explained. Each one has a special story. Charles nodded, his expression softening. I used to collect rocks as a child, he admitted quietly. They worked in careful coordination throughout the morning, professional movers efficiently boxing larger items while Rose handled their personal belongings. Charles moved between them, trying to be helpful while maintaining a respectful distance. His eyes often lingered on Noah's artwork on the walls or the height marks penciled near the kitchen door. By early afternoon, the apartment was nearly empty. Rose stood in Noah's room, running her hand along the baby blue walls she'd painted herself 5 years ago. Each scratch and scuff held a memory. Noah's first steps, his favorite reading corner, the spot where he'd accidentally drawn with permanent marker. Are you ready? Charles asked from the doorway, his voice gentle. Rose wiped away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. Yes, I suppose we are. The drive to Charles's building was quiet. Noah pressed against the window of the luxury SUV, pointing out everything that caught his attention. Rose sat beside him, her purse clutched tightly in her lap, while Charles rode up front with his driver. The penthouse took up the entire top floor of one of the city's most prestigious buildings. As the elevator doors opened directly into the foyer, Rose felt her breath catch. The space was immaculate, all clean lines, gleaming surfaces, and floor-to-ceiling windows offering spectacular views of the city. Your wing is this way, Charles said, leading them down a hallway. There are 3 bedrooms, a sitting room, and a private bathroom. I had the designers create a space for Noah that I hope he'll like. Noah's room was a revelation. The walls were painted a soft blue, similar to his old room, but with glow-in-the-dark stars scattered across the ceiling. A reading nook filled one corner, complete with built-in bookshelves and a cozy window seat. A desk stood ready for homework and art projects, and there was plenty of floor space for playing. Wow! Noah breathed, running to press his face against the window. Mommy, look! We can see the whole world from here. Rose watched as Charles's expression softened, a hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Throughout the afternoon, they unpacked Noah's belongings, with Charles awkwardly trying to help while maintaining his distance. His uncertainty was evident in every interaction, his hands often hovering mid-gesture before pulling back. As evening approached, Rose prepared Noah for bed in their new bathroom, the routine familiar even in these strange surroundings. Noah wore his favorite rocket ship pajamas, his damp hair curling slightly at the ends after his bath. Can Daddy read me a story? Noah asked suddenly, his voice hopeful. Rose hesitated, glancing towards the doorway where Charles had been hovering uncertainly. You'll have to ask him, sweetheart. Noah padded out to where Charles stood, looking up at him with those matching eyes. Will you read me a story? Please. Charles looked startled, then nervous. Yes, if you'd like. They settled into Noah's new room, Noah climbing into bed while Charles perched stiffly on the edge, holding a picture book about a brave little train. His reading was halting at first, his corporate-trained voice struggling to find the right tone for a children's story. But as the pages turned, something changed. His voice grew softer, more natural. He began showing Noah the pictures, answering quiet questions about the train's adventure. Rose watched from the doorway as the stiffness in Charles's shoulders gradually eased. Noah's eyes grew heavy as the story progressed, his small body curling trustingly toward Charles. When the last page was turned, Charles carefully closed the book, but didn't move. He sat there, watching his son's peaceful face as sleep claimed him. Rose saw the moment it hit him, the full weight of what he'd missed, what he'd gained, what he now had to protect. Charles reached out with a trembling hand and ever so gently brushed a curl from Noah's forehead. The soft lamplight, she could see the shimmer of tears in his eyes. He stood slowly, careful not to disturb the sleeping child. At the doorway, he paused beside Rose, his voice barely a whisper. "Thank you," he said, the words carrying the weight of everything he couldn't express. "For letting me be here for this." Rose nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. They stood together for a moment longer, watching Noah sleep in his new room under his ceiling of stars, while the city lights twinkled beyond the windows like a sea of earth-bound stars. Morning sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse kitchen, casting long golden rays across the pristine marble countertops. Rose stood at the stove, the familiar motion of flipping pancakes helping to settle her nerves in this unfamiliar space. Noah sat at the breakfast bar, swinging his legs as he carefully colored within the lines of his dinosaur coloring book. The soft ping of the elevator announced Charles's arrival from his morning workout. He paused in the kitchen doorway, his usual confident stride faltering slightly at the domestic scene before him. He was already dressed in one of his impeccable suits, but his expression held an uncertainty that his tailored armor couldn't hide. "Good morning," he said formally, then added with visible effort, "Something smells wonderful." "Mommy makes the best pancakes," Noah declared without looking up from his coloring. "She puts tiny chocolate chips in them that look like freckles." A ghost of a smile touched Charles's lips. "Is that so?" Rose placed a stack of golden pancakes on the breakfast bar. "Would you like some?" she offered quietly. "There's plenty." Charles hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you. I usually just have coffee, but—" He sat down next to Noah, maintaining a careful distance that spoke volumes about his discomfort. Noah pushed his coloring book toward Charles. "Look, I made the T-Rex blue. Blue is my favorite color." "Mine too," Charles replied softly, studying the carefully colored page with more attention than it probably warranted. Rose set plates in front of them both, then made one for herself. The kitchen fell into an awkward silence, broken only by the gentle clink of silverware and Noah's happy humming. Charles ate with precise movements, but his eyes kept drifting to Noah, studying the way the boy cut his pancakes into tiny pieces, just as Charles was doing. "We should leave in 30 minutes for Noah's appointment," Rose said finally, glancing at the clock. Charles straightened, his CEO demeanor sliding back into place. "Yes, of course. I've cleared my schedule for the day." At the hospital, the sterile corridors and antiseptic smell brought a different kind of tension to their strange family unit. Noah held Rose's hand tightly as they walked to the pediatric wing, his earlier cheerfulness dimming slightly. Charles followed a step behind, his presence both protective and uncertain. "Doctor," Sarah Chen greeted them warmly in her office, her kind eyes taking in the addition of Charles without missing a beat. "Noah, how are you feeling today, buddy?" "Good," Noah replied, already heading for the toy corner he knew well. "Mr. Crow," Dr. Chen acknowledged, "I understand you'd like to be brought up to speed on Noah's condition." For the next hour, Dr. Chen detailed Noah's medical history, the genetic condition that affected his blood's ability to clot properly, the careful monitoring required, the precautions needed in daily life. Charles listened with intense focus, asking precise questions that revealed both his business acumen and his personal familiarity with the condition. "I had no idea," he murmured at one point, watching as Noah played quietly with blocks across the room. "All this time." Rose touched his arm gently, surprising them both. "You know now. That's what matters." The day continued with more appointments, blood work, physical therapy exercises, a consultation with the hematologist. Through it all, Charles watched and learned, his notebook filling with careful observations and questions. He saw how Rose knew every doctor by name, how she anticipated Noah's needs before he voiced them, how she carried this weight with such quiet grace. By evening, they were all exhausted. Noah fell asleep on the car ride home, his head resting against Charles's arm, where he sat between them in the back seat. Charles remained perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe, as if afraid to disturb this fragile moment of trust. Back at the penthouse, Rose carried Noah to bed, while Charles retreated to his home office, overwhelmed by the day's emotions. Later, as he walked past Noah's room on his way to bed, he heard Rose's voice speaking softly. "And Lord, please watch over Charles," she prayed, her voice carrying through the partially open door. "Help him find his way through this. Give him strength to open his heart and wisdom to know how to be the father Noah needs. And thank you, Lord, for bringing healing to this broken situation in your perfect timing." Charles stood frozen in the hallway, something shifting deep within his chest. The walls he'd built so carefully over the years, the ones that kept him safe, kept him in control, seemed to crack just slightly. In the privacy of the darkened hallway, he pressed a hand to his heart, feeling its unsteady rhythm beneath his palm. The simple, earnest prayer continued, asking for blessings not just for Noah, but for him, the man who had been absent for 5 years, who had given them nothing but uncertainty. Rose's voice held no bitterness, no resentment, only genuine hope and compassion. A single tear slid down Charles' cheek, surprising him. He couldn't remember the last time he'd cried. Quietly he retreated to his room, but the warmth of Rose's prayer followed him, wrapping around his heart like a gentle embrace, beginning to thaw something that had been frozen for far too long. That night, for the first time in years, Charles Crowe fell asleep, not to the cold comfort of spreadsheets and business plans, but to the soft echoes of a prayer offered on his behalf, and the remarkable feeling that perhaps he wasn't as alone as he'd always believed. The morning sun cast long shadows through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Crowe Enterprises as Charles reviewed quarterly reports. His thoughts kept drifting to Noah's smile at breakfast, how the boy had asked him to help pour milk on his cereal. Such a simple thing, yet it had made Charles's heart squeeze with unfamiliar emotion. A sharp knock interrupted his reverie. Margaret Crowe swept into his office without waiting for a response, her designer heels clicking against the polished floor. Her presence commanded attention, just as it had since their father had first brought her into the family business 20 years ago. "Charles," she said, settling into the chair across from his desk. "Care to explain why you've been cancelling board meetings and rescheduling investor calls?" He met his sister's calculating gaze. "I've had personal matters to attend to." "Personal matters?" Margaret's perfectly shaped eyebrow arched. "Since when do you have personal matters? And why is your new assistant bringing a child to the office?" Charles's jaw tightened. "Rose Hart is an excellent employee. Her childcare arrangements are none of our concern. Everything that happens in this building is our concern." Margaret leaned forward. "The board is getting nervous, Charles. This isn't like you. First, you disappear for entire afternoons. Then I hear rumors about you being seen at Metropolitan Children's Hospital. Now this woman and her son are practically living in your office." "The company's performance hasn't suffered," Charles said firmly. "Not yet." Margaret's voice carried a warning. "But perception matters. We have shareholders to consider." Before Charles could respond, his phone buzzed. Rose's name flashed on the screen. His heart jumped. She never called during meetings. "Excuse me," he said, answering immediately. "Rose?" "Charles." Her voice was tight with panic. "Noah's having a bleeding episode. His nose won't stop and he's getting dizzy. I'm calling an ambulance." Charles was on his feet instantly. "Where are you?" "The break room on 12. Please hurry." "I'm coming." He grabbed his jacket, barely registering Margaret's startled expression. "Cancel everything." he ordered, already striding towards the door. "Charles!" Margaret called after him. "We're not finished here." But he was already gone, taking the stairs 2 at a time rather than waiting for the elevator. He burst into the break room to find Rose cradling Noah, whose small face was frighteningly pale. Blood-soaked paper towels littered the floor around them. "The ambulance is 3 minutes out," Rose said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. Noah's head lolled against her shoulder. "I'm cold, Mommy," he whispered. Charles shrugged off his jacket, wrapping it around Noah's shoulders. "Hold on, buddy. Help is coming." The next hours passed in a blur of sirens, emergency room chaos, and tense conversations with doctors. Charles paced the hospital corridor, while medical staff worked to stop the bleeding and stabilize Noah's blood pressure. Rose sat perfectly still in a hard plastic chair, her hands clasped in silent prayer. "Mr. Crow?" A nurse appeared. "You can see him now." Noah looked tiny in the hospital bed, tubes and monitors surrounding him. His normally cheerful face was drawn and pale, but his eyes brightened slightly when he saw them. "Daddy?" he whispered, reaching out a small hand. Charles's breath caught in his throat. It was the first time Noah had called him that. He moved forward automatically, taking Noah's hand in his own. "I'm here," he said hoarsely. "I'm right here." Rose touched his arm gently. "Why don't you sit with him while I speak to the doctor?" Charles nodded, lowering himself into the chair beside Noah's bed. The boy's eyes were already drooping with medication, but his grip on Charles's hand remained firm. "Will you stay?" Noah asked softly. "All night," Charles promised. "As long as you need." As evening deepened into night, Charles maintained his vigil. Rose dozed fitfully in another chair, but he couldn't sleep. He watched the steady rise and fall of Noah's chest, each breath a precious gift. The monitors beeped steadily, marking time in the quiet room. Memories of his own childhood hospitalizations surfaced, the loneliness, the fear, the stern faces of doctors. His father had been too busy running the company to stay, and his stepmother Margaret had considered illness a weakness. But Charles was determined to be different, to be better. Around 3 a.m, Noah stirred restlessly. "Thirsty," he mumbled. Charles carefully helped him sip water through a straw, supporting his head with a gentleness he hadn't known he possessed. When Noah drifted back to sleep, Charles found himself doing something he hadn't done in decades. He prayed. It wasn't an elegant prayer. He didn't know the right words. But in the pre-dawn darkness, watching his son's peaceful face, Charles poured out his heart in silent supplication. "Please," he thought. "Please let him be okay. I'll do anything. Be anything he needs. Just please." The sky was beginning to lighten when Dr. Chen arrived for morning rounds. She reviewed Noah's charts and vital signs with quiet efficiency. "The bleeding has stopped," she announced. "His numbers are stabilizing. We'll keep him for observation today, but I expect he can go home tomorrow." Relief washed over Charles in a powerful wave. He squeezed Noah's hand gently, looking up through the window as the first rays of sunrise painted the sky in soft pink and gold. "Thank you," he mouthed silently, meaning it with every fiber of his being. "Thank you." Sunlight streamed through the hospital room window as Noah stirred awake, his small face less pale than the night before. Charles, who hadn't left his side, straightened in his chair as Noah's eyes fluttered open. "Good morning, buddy," Charles said softly, squeezing his son's hand. Rose awakened at their voices, quickly moving to Noah's other side. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" "Better," Noah said, managing a weak smile. "Can I have breakfast?" Before they could answer, Dr. Chen entered the room, her white coat crisp and her manner gentle but professional. She checked Noah's vital signs while making friendly conversation about his favorite cartoons, putting him at ease. "Noah's responding well to the treatment," she said, turning to Charles and Rose. "But we need to discuss something important." She glanced meaningfully at Noah, who was now distracted by the morning cartoons Rose had turned on. They stepped into the hallway, where Dr. Chen's expression grew serious. "There's a new procedure that could help prevent these episodes. It's shown promising results in early trials, but—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "It carries risks. Without it, Noah will continue having these dangerous bleeding episodes. With it, we might be able to significantly improve his quality of life." Charles felt his chest tighten. "What kind of risks?" "The procedure involves gene therapy targeting the affected blood vessels. There's a 15% chance of complications, including severe bleeding or rejection, but if successful, it could reduce his episodes by up to 80%. Rose gripped the edge of her sweater, knuckles white. "When would you want to do this?" "The sooner the better. I'd recommend within the next 48 hours while we have him stabilized. I know it's a lot to process, but time is crucial." Charles and Rose exchanged looks, years of separate worry for Noah converging in that moment. "We need to discuss this," Rose said quietly. "Of course," Dr. Chen replied. "I'll have the complete information packet brought to you. Take some time to think it over." Back in Noah's room, they found him dozing again, the morning cartoons playing softly in the background. Charles pulled Rose aside by the window. "What are you thinking?" he asked. Rose wrapped her arms around herself, watching Noah sleep. "I'm terrified," she admitted. "But I've been praying for a solution for so long. What if this is the answer?" Charles ran a hand through his disheveled hair. "The risks. I know, but watching him suffer through these episodes—" She wiped away a tear. "What do you think?" It struck Charles how naturally they'd fallen into making this decision together, despite everything. "I think we need to give him this chance," he said slowly. "I've lived with this condition my whole life. If there had been something like this when I was his age—" They spent the morning reviewing the medical information, asking questions, and watching Noah closely. By afternoon, they had made their decision. Dr. Chen scheduled the procedure for 2 days later, setting things in motion with quiet efficiency. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of preparation. Noah underwent preliminary tests while Charles and Rose worked together to keep his spirits up. They read stories, played games, and tried to maintain a sense of normalcy in the sterile hospital environment. Charles cancelled all his meetings, delegating essential tasks to his executive team. For the first time in his career, the company wasn't his primary concern. He noticed how Rose's faith seemed to strengthen her, giving her a calm center despite her obvious worry. She prayed openly by Noah's bedside each night, and Charles found himself drawing comfort from the sound of her voice. On the evening before the procedure, after Noah had fallen asleep, Charles found Rose in the hospital chapel. She sat in the dim light, her Bible open in her lap. "May I join you?" he asked hesitantly. She nodded, moving over on the wooden pew. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the chapel's peace wrapping around them like a blanket. "I haven't been in a church since I was a child," Charles admitted quietly. Rose looked at him with gentle understanding. "God doesn't mind. He's just glad you're here." I wouldn't know what to say. "Just talk to him like you'd talk to Noah, from your heart." Charles thought about that, about the way he'd learned to open up with his son, about the walls that had started crumbling since Noah and Rose came into his life. The morning of the procedure dawned clear and cool. They arrived at the hospital early, Noah clutching his favorite stuffed dinosaur. The pre-op room was busy with nurses checking vital signs and adding medications to his IV. "Remember what we talked about?" Rose asked Noah, keeping her voice steady. The doctors are going to help make you stronger, like a superhero. Noah nodded bravely, though his lip trembled slightly. Will you be here when I wake up? Both of us, Charles promised, including himself naturally in the family circle. We'll be right here waiting. When it was time, they walked alongside Noah's gurney to the surgery doors. Rose kissed his forehead, whispering a prayer. Charles squeezed his small hand one last time. As they watched the doors close behind their son, Rose reached for Charles's hand. He took it, drawing strength from her touch. Together they moved to the waiting area, settling in for the long hours ahead. Charles felt something building in his chest, fear, hope, and something else he couldn't name. Without conscious thought, he found himself speaking. God, he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. I know I haven't talked to you in a long time, but please watch over my son. Guide the doctor's hands, bring him back to us safely. His voice broke on the last words. Rose's hand tightened in his, and together they waited, their prayers rising silently in the sterile hospital air. Through the windows, the morning sun continued its slow climb into the sky, marking the beginning of what would be the longest day of their lives. After 6 grueling hours in the waiting room, Dr. Chen finally emerged through the double doors, still wearing his surgical cap. Charles and Rose stood immediately, hands clasped tightly together. The procedure was successful. Dr. Chen announced with a warm smile. Noah did beautifully. We were able to complete the entire correction without any complications. Rose's knees buckled slightly, and Charles steadied her with an arm around her shoulders. Tears streamed down her face as relief flooded through her. Thank you, God, she whispered. Thank you, thank you. Charles found himself fighting back his own tears. When can we see him? He's in recovery now. Give us about 30 minutes to get him settled in his room, and then you can go in. He'll be groggy from the anesthesia, but he should wake up periodically throughout the evening. The next hour passed in a blur of updates from nurses and quiet thanksgiving. When they finally entered Noah's room, the sight of their small son surrounded by monitors and tubes made them both pause. But his color was good, and his breathing was steady and strong. Rose went immediately to his bedside, gently stroking his hair back from his forehead. Charles stood at the foot of the bed, overwhelmed by the depth of his feelings for this child he'd known for such a short time. Throughout that night, they took turns sitting with Noah as he drifted in and out of consciousness. Each time he opened his eyes, both parents were there, offering soft words of comfort and reassurance. By morning, Noah was more alert, asking for water and complaining that his throat hurt. The nurses brought him ice chips and promised popsicles later if he continued to improve. Charles watched in amazement as his son's resilient spirit began to shine through the post-surgical haze. Daddy? Noah called out weakly, reaching for Charles's hand. Will you tell me a story? Charles's heart swelled at the word Daddy. Without hesitation, he pulled his chair closer and began weaving a tale about a brave little knight who faced a dragon and won. The next few days showed steady improvement. Noah's medical team was pleased with his progress, and his vital signs remained strong. Charles split his time between the hospital and essential work meetings, while Rose remained a constant presence at Noah's bedside. On the 4th day, Dr. Chen declared Noah ready to go home. The drive back to the penthouse was filled with Noah's excited chatter about showing his battle scar to his stuffed animals. Remember, young man, Rose cautioned gently, you still need lots of rest and careful movement. I know, Mummy, Noah said, then turned to Charles. Daddy, will you help me build a pillow fort later? A small one? Charles caught Rose's eye in the rearview mirror, seeking approval. At her slight nod, he smiled. A small One sounds perfect, buddy. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of recovery milestones and growing family bonds. Charles surprised himself by how naturally he fell into the rhythm of fatherhood. He learned to check Noah's temperature without fumbling the thermometer, to measure medications exactly, and to tell when his son was trying to push past his prescribed activity limits. More importantly, he learned the small moments that made up a child's day. The way Noah's hair stuck up in the morning, his preference for the blue cup at breakfast, the specific voice he used for each of his stuffed animals. Charles found himself storing away these details like precious gems, building a treasury of fatherhood he'd never expected to have. One evening, about 3 weeks after the surgery, Charles arrived home early from work to find Rose and Noah in the kitchen. The counter was dusted with flour, and the air smelled of vanilla and warmth. "We're making cookies," Noah announced from his perch on a kitchen stool, his hands covered in cookie dough. "I can see that." Charles laughed, setting down his briefcase and rolling up his sleeves. "Need another helper?" Rose's surprise melted into pleasure as Charles joined them at the counter. She showed him how to roll the dough into balls and press them down with a fork, creating the classic peanut butter cookie pattern. "Like this?" he asked, concentrating intently on the task. "Perfect," Rose assured him, their eyes meeting over Noah's head. The kitchen filled with laughter as Noah told stories about his day, imitating his teacher's voice and acting out playground adventures. When the cookies were done, they sat together at the kitchen island, dunking warm cookies in cold milk and leaving crumbs everywhere. "Can we do this every night?" Noah asked hopefully. "Maybe not cookies every night," Rose amended, "but family dinner together? I think we can manage that." "Family dinner," Charles repeated softly, savoring the words. They settled into a routine of evening meals together, sharing stories about their days and making plans for the weekend. Charles found himself looking forward to these moments more than any business success. One particular evening, they were celebrating Noah's latest clean bill of health from Dr. Chen. Rose had prepared Noah's favorite spaghetti and meatballs, and the conversation flowed easily between them. Noah was demonstrating how he'd learned to twirl pasta on his fork, his face a picture of concentration. "Look, Daddy, no hands!" he proclaimed proudly, managing to get most of the spaghetti into his mouth. "Very impressive," Charles praised, dabbing sauce from Noah's chin with a napkin. The gesture felt so natural now, so right. Rose watched them with shining eyes, her own meal temporarily forgotten. The sound of their laughter echoed through the penthouse, creating a warmth that no designer could have planned. None of them noticed the figure standing in the shadows of the building across the street. Margaret Crowe lowered her binoculars, her perfectly manicured nails tapping thoughtfully against the leather case. Her keen eyes had missed nothing. Not the domestic scene playing out in the penthouse windows, not the easy familiarity between Charles and the boy, and certainly not the way her nephew seemed to have created a family without consulting her. The corner of her mouth turned down as she watched them share a bowl of ice cream for dessert, their heads bent together in conspiracy and joy. This would require careful handling. Very careful handling indeed. Inside the penthouse, blissfully unaware of the watching eyes, Charles helped Noah clean chocolate ice cream from his face, while Rose began clearing the dishes. Their laughter continued to fill the space, transforming the once sterile penthouse into something warm and alive. A home. The morning sun cast long shadows across Margaret Crowe's mahogany desk as she studied the DNA test results in her hands. Her fingers, adorned with an heirloom ruby ring, traced the lines of data that confirmed what her surveillance had already suggested. The boy living in Charles's penthouse was more than just a child. He was a Crowe heir. Margaret placed the paper down with deliberate care, her burgundy nails tapping a steady rhythm on her desk. She had called in countless favors to obtain these results, but the investment had paid off. Now she understood why her usually predictable nephew had been acting so strangely these past weeks. The intercom buzzed. "Mr. Crow is here to see you, Mrs. Crow." "Send him in," Margaret replied, her voice as smooth as aged whiskey. Charles entered the office with his usual confident stride, but Margaret noticed the slight shadows under his eyes, the softening around his jaw that spoke of home-cooked meals and late nights reading bedtime stories. "Aunt Margaret?" he greeted, settling into one of the leather chairs across from her desk. What was so urgent it couldn't wait until the board meeting? Margaret lifted the DNA results. "I think you know exactly why I called you here, Charles." She watched the color drain from his face. "Did you really think you could hide a Crow heir from me?" Charles's hands gripped the armrests. "How did you get those results?" "That's hardly important now, is it?" Margaret leaned forward. "What matters is that your little secretary's son, your son, poses a significant risk to this company's stability. The board won't take kindly to learning that their CEO has been harboring a secret love child." "Noah is not a risk," Charles said, his voice tight. "He's my son, and this is a private family matter." Margaret's laugh was sharp. "Private? Nothing about the Crow family is private, Charles. You know that better than anyone." She stood, moving to the window that overlooked the city. "The board meeting is at 4 o'clock this afternoon. They'll want answers about these rumors of your domestic situation." Charles rose to his feet. "What do you want, Margaret?" She turned to face him, her expression calculated. "Want? I want what's best for this company. What's best for the Crow name. Send them away, Charles. Give the girl enough money to keep her quiet, and let's put this unfortunate situation behind us." "No." The word came out like a gunshot. "Then I'll have no choice but to inform the board myself." Margaret's voice hardened. "Think carefully about what you're risking here. Everything your father built, everything you've worked for, all of it could crumble because of one indiscretion." Charles's jaw clenched. "I'll handle the board meeting myself." "You have until 4 o'clock to make the right decision," Margaret called after him as he strode out of her office. The hours crawled by like years. Charles paced his office, making calls, cancelling meetings, trying to find a way through this maze that wouldn't hurt his newfound family. By 3:30, his desk was covered in legal documents and crisis management strategies. The board meeting itself was brutal. Charles stood at the head of the long table, facing the suspicious stares of 12 board members as Margaret sat at the far end, a slight smile playing at her lips. "Mr. Crow," one of the older board members began, "these rumors about a child living in your penthouse, a child who may have claim to the Crow fortune, are deeply concerning." Charles straightened his tie. "My personal life is not up for discussion." "It is when it affects shareholder confidence." Another board member cut in. "We've already seen a 2% drop in stock value since these whispers began." The meeting dragged on for hours, voices rising and falling like waves against rocks. Charles defended his position, but he could see the tide turning against him. By the time he left the boardroom, his shirt was damp with sweat, and his head pounded with tension. He didn't notice Rose standing in the shadows of the hallway, didn't see her slip away as he spoke into his phone. "We need to consider all options. Yes, I understand the pressure. The board's concerns aren't without merit." Rose's heart hammered in her chest as she hurried back to her desk. She had come to deliver some late files, but what she'd heard froze her blood. The words echoed in her mind as she gathered her things and left for the day. All options, pressure, board's concerns. That evening, the penthouse felt different to Rose. Colder somehow, despite the warm spring air flowing through the open windows. She watched Charles pick at his dinner, his mind clearly elsewhere. and saw the weight of the day's meetings in every line of his face. Noah was already asleep when Charles received another call. He stepped onto the balcony to take it, his voice carrying faintly through the glass. "I know what's at stake. I need time to think it through. Yes, I understand what the company needs." Rose's chest tightened. She had been naive to think this could work, to believe that Charles Crowe would choose their makeshift family over his empire. The signs were all there. His distraction at dinner, the hushed phone calls, the way he'd barely looked at Noah all evening. After Charles left for a late-night emergency meeting, Rose moved through the penthouse like a ghost. She packed efficiently, years of practice making her movements quick and quiet. Noah's favorite stuffed animals went first, then his clothes, then the medications he would need. She left behind anything Charles had bought them, taking only what they had brought. As she worked, tears slid silently down her face. She had let herself hope, let herself believe that God had finally given them the family she'd prayed for. But some dreams were too fragile to survive in the harsh light of reality. She wrote a short note and left it on the kitchen counter. "We won't be a burden to you or your company. Noah will always know he was loved, even if only for a little while." The clock struck 11, as Rose gently lifted a sleeping Noah from his bed. He stirred slightly, mumbling, "Daddy coming to read story?" "Not tonight, baby," Rose whispered, her voice breaking. "We need to go on a little trip." She took one last look at the penthouse. At the pillow fort still standing in the corner of the living room. At the refrigerator covered in Noah's drawings. At the family photos Charles had insisted on displaying. Then she turned away, closing the door softly behind her. The night air was cool as Rose carried Noah to the waiting taxi, her bag slung over her shoulder. The city lights blurred through her tears as they pulled away from the building, leaving behind the dream of what could have been. The morning sun streamed through the penthouse windows, casting long shadows across empty rooms. Charles loosened his tie as he stepped out of the elevator, his mind still churning with strategies from an early morning meeting. "Rose!" he called out, expecting to hear the usual sounds of breakfast preparation or Noah's cheerful chatter. Silence answered. Something felt wrong. The air held a stillness that made his skin prickle. "Noah?" His voice echoed off the marble floors as he moved through the space, his footsteps quickening. The kitchen was untouched, no signs of breakfast. Noah's favorite cereal box wasn't on the counter. Charles's heart began to race as he noticed the folded paper propped against the coffee maker. His hands trembled as he read Rose's note. The words blurred before his eyes. "We won't be a burden to you or your company. Noah will always know he was loved, even if only for a little while." "No," he whispered, the paper crumpling in his fist. He rushed to Noah's room, throwing open the door. The bed was made, but the drawers hung open, empty. The stuffed giraffe Noah couldn't sleep without was gone. In Rose's room, the closet gaped bare except for the designer clothes he'd bought her, clothes she'd never wanted. Charles sank onto Rose's bed, his legs no longer able to hold him. The weight of what he'd lost crashed over him like a wave. He'd done it again, chosen power over love, just as his own father had. The realization made him physically ill. His phone buzzed. Another message from Margaret about the emergency board meeting scheduled for 2 o'clock. He hurled the phone across the room, watching it bounce off the wall. What good was an empire if it cost him his son? What good was power if it left him alone? Memories flooded his mind. Noah's small hand in his as they walked through the park. The way his son's eyes lit up when Charles read bedtime stories. The sound of his laughter echoing through these now empty rooms. He remembered Rose's quiet strength, her unwavering faith, the way she'd begun to trust him despite everything. "Dear God," he whispered, surprising himself with the prayer. "I've made such a mess of things." His phone buzzed again from where it had landed. Charles retrieved it, seeing multiple missed calls from his assistant. When he finally answered, the news made his blood run cold. "Sir, Ms. Crow is preparing a press release. She's planning to announce Noah's existence to the media. She's framing it as a transparency initiative, claiming the board has a responsibility to shareholders." Charles didn't hear the rest. Margaret was going to use his son, his 5-year-old boy who needed protection and privacy, as a corporate pawn. She would expose Noah to the media circus, subject him to public scrutiny, all to force Charles's hand. Something shifted inside him, like tectonic plates realigning. The choice he'd been struggling with suddenly became crystal clear. For too long, he'd tried to protect both his corporate kingdom and his newfound family. But Noah deserved better than a father who put profit margins before love. Charles stood, straightening his suit jacket. "Cancel the press release," he ordered his assistant, "and call an immediate board meeting. Everyone, now." "But sir, the 2 o'clock meeting." "Now," Charles repeated, his voice hard as steel. "And get me everything we have on Margaret's dealings for the past 5 years. Everything." As he strode toward the elevator, Charles paused at Noah's room one last time. A single crayon drawing remained taped to the wall, 3 stick figures holding hands with "My family" written in wobbly letters across the top. Charles gently took it down, folded it, and placed it in his breast pocket, right over his heart. The ride down to the office felt different this time. Each floor that passed strengthened his resolve. He thought of his own childhood, growing up in the shadow of a corporate titan who had no time for baseball games or bedtime stories. He thought of Rose's quiet dignity and unwavering moral compass. Most of all, he thought of Noah, sweet, brave Noah, who had opened his heart with nothing more than a whispered truth and a trusting smile. By the time the elevator doors opened onto the executive floor, Charles Crow was a changed man. The board members were already gathering, their faces showing mixture of confusion and annoyance at the sudden summons. Margaret sat in her usual place, her perfectly manicured nails tapping impatiently on the mahogany table. Charles walked past them all without a word, taking his place at the head of the table. He placed his hands flat on its polished surface and looked each board member in the eye. The room fell silent. "Before we begin," he said, his voice steady and clear, "I want to make something perfectly clear. My son is not a bargaining chip. He's not a PR strategy. And he's certainly not a weapon to be used against me." Margaret's smile faltered as Charles met her gaze directly. "And anyone who thinks otherwise," he continued, "is about to learn exactly what I'm willing to fight for." The boardroom air felt thick with tension as Charles stood before the 12 members of Crow Enterprises' board of directors. Afternoon sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the mahogany table. He could feel their eyes on him, some curious, others hostile, all waiting. "5 years ago," Charles began, his voice steady despite his racing heart, "I made a choice that changed lives. Today I'm making another one." He pulled out a stack of folders and began passing them around the table. "But first, let's discuss what's really going on here." Margaret's perfectly composed face tightened as she opened her folder. Inside were detailed records of questionable transactions, backdated contracts, and evidence of systematic corruption that Charles's team had uncovered in the past 24 hours. These documents show years of misappropriated funds, manipulated contracts, and personal enrichment at the company's expense. Charles's words cut through the shocked silence. "Margaret, would you care to explain why your private account in the Cayman Islands received regular deposits, matching the exact amounts of our consulting fees to shell companies?" The colour drained from Margaret's face. Other board members began flipping through their folders more urgently, whispers breaking out around the table. "This is ridiculous!" Margaret snapped, but her voice wavered. "You're trying to deflect from your own scandal. Your illegitimate child—" "My son," Charles interrupted, his tone sharp enough to silence the room. "His name is Noah Hart. He's 5 years old. He loves dinosaurs, drawing pictures, and asking questions about everything he sees. He's kind, brave, and far more important than any business empire." Charles pulled Noah's crayon drawing from his pocket, unfolding it carefully. "I've spent my entire life building this company, believing power was the only thing that mattered. I was wrong." He placed the drawing on the table, those simple stick figures speaking volumes. "Noah taught me that love isn't a weakness. It's the greatest strength we have." The board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unused to such naked emotion from their typically stoic CEO. Charles continued, his voice growing stronger. "I'm not here to negotiate or defend myself. I'm here to tell you that effective immediately, I'm stepping down as CEO of Crow Enterprises." Gasps filled the room. "I've already contacted the SEC about the irregularities in our books. A full investigation will begin tomorrow." Margaret shot to her feet. "You can't do this! You'll destroy everything!" "No, Margaret, you did that yourself." Charles's calm response carried more weight than any shout. "I'm choosing my family, something I should have done from the beginning." He gathered his things, leaving the drawing on the table. "The authorities will be here within the hour. I suggest you all cooperate fully." His eyes swept the room one final time. "I built this company on innovation and integrity. Somewhere along the way we lost sight of what matters. I'm sorry for my part in that." Without another word, Charles walked out of the boardroom, leaving chaos in his wake. He could hear raised voices and accusations flying as the door closed behind him, but none of it mattered anymore. His heart was racing with a different purpose now. As he rode the elevator down to the lobby, Charles called every contact he had, trying to locate Rose and Noah. It took hours of desperate searching before a quiet voice on the phone gave him what he needed. Rose had been seen entering St. Michael's Church on the east side of town. The sun was setting as Charles parked his car outside the small brick church. Through the stained glass windows, he could see the warm glow of evening light mixing with candlelight. His footsteps echoed on the stone path leading to the heavy wooden doors. For a moment, he hesitated. What right did he have to disturb her prayers? But then he remembered Noah's smile, Rose's quiet strength, and the family they could be. Taking a deep breath, Charles reached for the door handle. The ancient hinges creaked softly as he stepped into the sacred space. The scent of candle wax and old wood filled his lungs, and somewhere in the shadows ahead, he knew Rose was praying for guidance, just as he was praying for the courage to make things right. Charles's footsteps echoed softly through the empty church as he walked down the center aisle. In the dim light, he could make out Rose's silhouette in the front pew, her head bowed in prayer. Noah lay sleeping beside her, his small form curled up on the wooden bench. The sight stopped Charles in his tracks. His heart ached with a pain he'd never known before, the pain of almost losing what mattered most. Taking a deep breath, he moved forward quietly until he stood just a few feet away. "Rose," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. She turned, startled, then quickly wiped her eyes. "Charles, please," he interrupted gently. "Let me speak first." He knelt down beside the pew, humbling himself before her. "I've spent my whole life thinking I had to be perfect, that showing emotion was weakness, that power was everything. I was wrong about all of it." In the gentle glow of candlelight, tears glistened in his eyes. "I walked away from everything today. The company, the board, all of it. I told them about Noah, about who I really am, and for the first time in my life, I felt free. Rose watched him carefully, her expression guarded but softening. Why? Because none of it matters without you and Noah. Charles's voice cracked with emotion. I'm not asking for control or making demands. I'm asking for forgiveness. For the chance to be the father Noah deserves and the man worthy of your trust. He reached for her hand tentatively. I know I've made mistakes, terrible ones. But meeting you that night 5 years ago wasn't one of them. It gave me Noah. It led me to you again. And if you'll let me, I want to spend the rest of my life making up for lost time. Rose's fingers trembled as they wrapped around his. I was so afraid, she whispered. Afraid you'd use your power to take him from me. Afraid you'd see us as a liability. Never, Charles said firmly. You and Noah are my greatest blessing. I see that now. I'll spend every day proving it to you both, if you'll give me the chance. Noah stirred slightly in his sleep, murmuring something about dinosaurs. They both smiled, their eyes meeting in shared tenderness for their son. What happens now? Rose asked softly. Now we rebuild, together. Charles squeezed her hand gently. I've already started the process of restructuring the company ethically. There will be investigations, changes, probably some difficult times ahead. But I promise you, I'm doing it the right way this time. The weeks that followed proved the truth of Charles's words. Day by day, he worked tirelessly to transform Crow Enterprises while making time for his family. The media storm around the corruption scandal gradually subsided as Charles cooperated fully with authorities and implemented sweeping reforms. Every morning began with family breakfast, Noah chattering excitedly about school while Charles and Rose shared quiet smiles over coffee. In the evenings, Charles would read bedtime stories, no longer awkward but fully embracing the joy of fatherhood. He never missed a doctor's appointment, school event, or family dinner. At work, Charles built a new leadership team committed to transparency and ethical business practices. He reduced his own salary, established a foundation for children with rare medical conditions, and created family-friendly workplace policies. The press began calling it the Crow Revolution, but Charles knew it was simply living up to the man his son believed him to be. Rose watched the transformation with growing trust and admiration. She saw how Charles would stop everything to take Noah's calls, how he'd spend hours helping with homework, how he prayed with them each night. This wasn't the cold, powerful CEO she'd feared. This was a man learning to love with his whole heart. 1 month after that night in the church, Charles planned a special evening. He asked Rose to meet him in the penthouse garden after work, where Noah was already waiting excitedly. The space had been transformed with twinkling lights, and Noah's artwork displayed proudly on easels. As Rose stepped onto the rooftop, Noah ran to hug her. "Mommy, look what we made!" Charles stepped forward, taking her hand. Together, they walked through a gallery of Noah's drawings, their whole story told through a child's eyes. The first meeting in the office, bedtime stories, hospital visits, family dinners, each moment captured in crayon and love. At the final easel, Noah bounced excitedly. "This one's new! I just made it!" Rose looked at the drawing and gasped softly. It showed 3 stick figures holding hands, with a big heart around them, and the words, "My family," written in Noah's careful printing. Charles knelt down, one knee on the ground, still holding Rose's hand. Noah stood beside him, beaming with pride as his father pulled out a small velvet box. "Rose," Charles said softly, his voice full of emotion, "you taught me what real love looks like. Through your faith, your strength, your grace, you showed me the man I could be. Noah made me a father, but you made me whole." He opened the box, revealing a simple but elegant ring. Will you make us a family? Will you marry me?" Noah wrapped his arms around both of them as they knelt there, 3 hearts beating as one, waiting for the word that would complete their journey from strangers to family. Rose looked at their son's hopeful face, then into Charles's eyes, seeing all the love and commitment she'd ever dreamed of finding. Tears of joy spilled down her cheeks as she squeezed both their hands and whispered, "Yes." The morning sun filtered through stained glass windows, casting rainbow patterns across the small church's wooden pews. Rose stood before the mirror in the tiny preparation room, smoothing her simple white dress with trembling hands. No elaborate decorations adorned the space, just fresh wild flowers and sunlight, exactly as she'd wanted. Through the door she could hear the gentle murmur of the intimate gathering. Friends from work, church members who'd supported her through the years, and a handful of trusted colleagues who'd stood by Charles during the company's transformation. Noah peeked his head in, dressed in a miniature suit that matched his father's. "Mommy, you look like an angel," he whispered in awe. Rose knelt down, careful not to wrinkle her dress, and hugged him close. "Thank you, sweetheart. Are you ready to help walk me down the aisle?" He nodded solemnly, taking his role as both ring-bearer and escort very seriously. "Daddy's waiting. He looks nervous, but happy nervous." The church piano began playing softly as Rose took Noah's small hand. Together they walked down the aisle, past the smiling faces of their chosen family. Charles stood at the altar, his eyes filling with tears as he watched them approach. The ceremony was beautifully simple. The pastor spoke of love, forgiveness, and new beginnings. When it came time for the vows, Charles's voice was steady and sure. "Rose, you showed me that true strength lies in opening your heart, not closing it. You and Noah are my miracle, my second chance at life. I promise to cherish you both, to walk in faith beside you, and to love you with everything I am." Rose's voice shook slightly as she responded, "Charles, you taught me that trust can be rebuilt, that love can heal old wounds. I promise to stand with you, to believe in you, and to build our future together in faith and truth." After the ceremony, they celebrated with a modest reception in the church hall, filled with laughter and heartfelt toasts. As evening approached, the new family returned to their home, no longer just Charles's penthouse, but a true family home filled with Noah's artwork, Rose's books, and countless photos of their journey together. That night, as stars appeared over the city, Charles sat on the edge of Noah's bed with a Bible in his hands. Rose leaned against the doorframe, watching as father and son read together about David's courage, Noah's faith, and God's endless love. "Just like God gave David a new heart," Charles explained softly. "He gave me one too, through you and Mummy." Noah snuggled deeper under his covers, sleepy but content. "I always knew you had a good heart, Daddy. You just needed help finding it again." "Thank you for being here. If something in this story stayed with you, I'd love to see you again. Subscribe, and tomorrow I'll bring you another story crafted with heart."